Hi, everyone. My name is Elise Rosemarin. Thank you for joining us this evening. Tonight, we'll be discussing virtual annual meetings and to get some legal advice from our fantastic colleague, Marc Schneider, who is joining us from Schneider Buchel. So just to give you a little bit of everyone's background who's joining us tonight, we've got Marc Schneider, who is the managing partner of Schneider Buchel, where he primarily focuses his practices in the areas of cooperative, condominium, and the homeowners association law. He's been involved in representing community associations for over 2 decades and is well known in his effective representation of their issues. He is a legal advisor of the Great Neck Co-op and Condominium Council, a member of the Council of the New York Cooperatives and Condominiums Association, and a member of the New York State Bar Association Committee on Condominiums and Cooperatives. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Marc.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
And then we have our wonderful own Adjourn Kurian, who is a senior vice president here at AKAM. Adjourn has a working knowledge of every facet of residential building management. His understanding of the needs of property owners and residents have been critical to AKAM's clients throughout COVID and their flurry of new regulations that we've been seeing in New York City and throughout the metropolitan area. And he helps AKAMs manage properties, interpret guidelines, and incorporate them into the building's day-to-day and long-term operations and procedures. All right, so we're going to get started. We're going to do an overview about what's going on and how we're starting to see some changes throughout and what we've seen throughout COVID. And then, of course, we're going to do a Q&A session at the end where we welcome you to ask us any questions that you have brewing. And as usual, if you've been attending these, and if not, we always welcome questions throughout and after. So please feel free to reach us. All of our information will be given to you at the end, and we encourage you to email us whenever you have questions throughout, now or later. So thank you, everyone. All right, so the overview tonight, we're going to do a discussion about the legality of virtual annual meetings, curating the meeting, candidate and election protocols, communication, proxy and ballots, running the meeting, and again, the Q&A. All right, gentlemen, if you want to take it away, let's get started. I know we were just briefly discussing how Zoom has changed annual meetings, but I know that you have a lot more meat to that. So
yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So thanks again for having me participate this evening, and for all of you folks that are watching. Look, I think that we understand that the pandemic has changed things. And while we could say that the pandemic has been a bad thing, it has not all of it has been bad. And I always say out of every bad thing, usually something good comes out. And I think that the virtual annual meeting is one of those byproducts that has been created as a result of the pandemic. Certainly, we all know that technology has advanced itself. Probably, it is probably now where it would be maybe 5 or 10 years from now. And for most co-ops and condos, you're used to that in-person meeting. But when the pandemic hit and all of the executive orders with regard to gathering limitations came about, we know that we no longer could have those in-person meetings. And those in-person meetings, not only, even if we could have them and they weren't banned by the executive orders, we would have exposure to potentially causing someone to get coronavirus or otherwise. So in the beginning, it was not very widely adopted, this concept of a virtual annual meeting. But as time went on and people became realizing that we weren't going to be able to have an in-person meeting anytime soon, more and more of the boards that that our firm represents started to consider and actually put their toe into the water to hold a virtual annual meeting. What I will say is that we do want to talk about the legality, because for co-ops, fortunately, the executive order was enacted, and actually the law which governs annual meetings, which is section 602 of the Business Corporation Law for co-ops, because co-ops are business corporations, actually was amended to provide that a meeting of shareholders can be held virtually. And without the executive order and the change in the law, technically speaking, you don't have the ability to do that. And what I tell you is that the law specifically states that it is this way until December 31st of 2021. Whether that gets extended or not, who knows? I will tell you that for many of the co-ops that we represent that have done virtual annual meetings, they're already starting to think about, well, we like this, we love this, and tonight we're going to talk about some of the pros and cons in a little while, and we want to be able to keep doing it. And one of the ways that they can ensure themselves of that, I have one co-op right now has their shareholders considering an amendment to allow this permanently. For condominiums, on the other hand, the executive orders did not cover this. And technically speaking, a condominium can't really do a virtual annual meeting. There are some workarounds for it and ways that we can accomplish that. And I'm sure later on through the program, I'll give a little bit of a presentation. I'll speak a little bit about how we can get around doing that. But for a condo, technically, you don't have a right to do it. If you're a homeowners association, they are also covered by the amendment to the not-for-profit corporation law. Look, there are so many laws and executive orders that have came about as a result of the pandemic, and not everything has been caught. And I think that's largely a function of, if you look at all the laws that have affected co-ops recently, where co-ops got sucked into being classified as a landlord-tenant relationship, which they are, but they really didn't have a clear understanding of what a co-op is. It's not surprising that co-ops are protected here, but condominiums are not, because I think the community association in general really wasn't contemplated when some of these changes were made.
It's really interesting that they chose to, focus on co-ops, but then condos were not able to have the same abilities in some ways. But it sounds like there is some optionality as far as ways to get around it. And Audrey, did you find the same?
Yeah. Yes, there was certainly a mix, and as Marc mentioned before, some of our co-ops were hesitant to go the virtual annual meeting route, and others, as Marc said, dip their toes in, and so we had a good mix of them. But thankfully, they all the first round of them last year worked out extremely well, and they were all well prepared for it.
That's great. So, as far as the meeting versus a webinar, clearly right now, this is a webinar, but meetings have a different function. So do you want to discuss a little bit more about that?
Sure. I can take that, and then Marc, if you want to jump in. So in the webinar format, by and large, without getting into too much of the technical details, in the webinar format, it's basically the board and the panelists running the meeting. There's not a lot of participation from the audience. There is, of course, the Q&A function, and that should be enabled, and that should be discussed as to how that's going to be enabled. And then the meeting format is typically like how you would have like in your work day or in your work environment, where everybody would be seen on it. You could freely speak and things like that. So those are the two key. That's the key difference there between webinar and meeting format.
Yeah, and what I would say to you is, one of the challenges that you might have, and it would be depending on the size of your community, of your co-op or your condo. And what I'll tell you is that I did an annual meeting of a community that was 1,200 units, and it went really fine. And I think what you're going to find is that as long as you plan properly and with a great management company and a good attorney, you have the ability to do that. And what I mean by that is for example, on questions, when you send out the notice of the meeting, you can put in the notice, given the fact that this is going to be held virtually, if you would like to ask questions, please submit them in writing in advance. This way, the board is prepared to answer them, and we don't have to go looking around a screen to find you. Now, on buildings that are smaller, it's very easy to manage the questions. And by the way, there's Q&A boxes just like you have on this webinar right here, where you can see the live questions as they're coming in and answer them that way as well. So one of the things I will tell you, one of the beauties of a webinar versus a meeting in person is that many of you that have experienced in-person annual meetings will probably find that sometimes they get unruly because one person starts, complaining about something, and before you know it, you've got 20 people jumping on the bandwagon, and now you're trying to control the room. Whereas in a Zoom type annual meeting, when we conduct them, we have everybody come in muted, and they can only get unmuted by the host, oftentimes myself or a property manager, who will then unmute them based on their hand being raised. So it's not people jumping in and out. And I've found that, I'm sure Ajo will agree with me on this, that you get through your agenda a lot quicker, and with covering everything you want to cover without any sidebars or side issues. So I think that most buildings that have done Zoom annual meetings probably would agree that they want to continue to do them forever, because even though there's more involved in putting them together initially, right? Because you need to, cover things that we're going to talk about shortly about how to vote and otherwise. Think about the fact that when your accountant is talking about the financial statements at your annual meeting live, he's usually he or she's holding up the financial statement and reading from a piece of paper. Whereas on a webinar, they share the screen just like this one has a presentation. And now everybody's looking at the page. And if the accountant wants to highlight, a particular line of the budget, he literally takes his cursor, highlights it, everybody's staring at it. So it's no longer, did you get your financial statement? It's here it is in front of you, and let's talk about the issues.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think it fosters a better environment for collaborative conversation and just discussion back and forth, especially when it comes to the finances and questions that owners may have.
I've actually heard that people seem to think that there's more of an attendance actually increase since it's gone on Zoom, because it's much easier to pop in from wherever you are and you can pop out. So it seems that this is a preferable way to continuously do the annual meeting. Is there a preference that you have as far as just doing it, which type you prefer, meeting versus webinar, or does it really case by case?
I think that the Zoom type platform, the webinar type platform is certainly going to be the way that a lot of buildings are going to want to continue to go. And I agree with the comment you just made, Elise, which is that there's definitely a larger attendance. And it's just because you could be sitting in your shareholder could be sitting in their living room, and it's like watching TV, so to speak. Most shareholders, really all they want is the information, right? Sometimes they have questions. So you will get a larger attendance, which, by the way, will help you if you want to get a quorum. I know a lot of buildings can never get quorums. This is one of the ways where you might be able to accomplish it easier. But I think that even if you were one of those buildings who said, well, I don't really care if I have a quorum, nobody ever really runs for the board. I think being able to just conduct your presentations in a clear, concise manner without having interruption is such a benefit. And by the way, all your professionals are in wherever, whether they're in their office or their home, they're no longer traveling. There's a cost savings there too. If you're paying your professionals to travel to a meeting, you're not paying them anymore. It's minute on, minute off. And by the way, when the meeting's over, nobody has to go anywhere. And if you are, if you're working and you can't get home in time, you don't have to worry about that either. So I think the webinar the Zoom type platform is hopefully here to stay. And I think most boards that have done it will agree.
Yeah, it sounds to be much more lifestyle friendly, especially since, being on the board is, it's something that is time consuming. It's nice that this is a little bit less so. All right, so next for our next questions that we have for you. In the meantime, I'm going to ask a quick question. If no one's running against the current BOD, is it necessary to give out ballots?
Yeah, so the answer is if it's an uncontested election, you don't need to, for the board of directors, you do not need to give out ballots. And that's largely because there's nobody running against anyone. And what I typically do is I would ask for someone to affirm the slate, someone to make a motion from the attendees saying, I hereby vote to move to affirm the slate of 5 candidates for the board. I guess for a second, all in favor, and you move on. You don't kill the trees, or in this case, the electronic voting that you might have. So no, you don't need to do that.
Right. See, that's another positive, saving trees. Very economically friendly. All right. So as far as candidates and election protocol, we just kind of touched upon this a little bit. How do you handle floor nominations? Do you do a separate candidate night? Do you do third-party election companies? Can you guys speak a little bit to these topics?
Let me tap into the first one.
Sure.
If you're going to do a virtual meeting, you cannot do nominations from the floor because it would just create chaos.
Interesting. Okay.
But there's a benefit to that, right? Because what we've done is when the boards decide they want to do a virtual annual meeting, we have them send out, and management usually will send this letter out, a letter to the community saying, hey, we're going to have our annual meeting on this date. And if you are interested in running for the board, given that we are going to be conducting this annual meeting virtually, we need you to declare your candidacy in advance and put a deadline and indicate that after that deadline, no one will be considered. For our boards that do this, if they don't have nomination procedures in place, we usually will draft a resolution for the board to adopt so that they can create these policies and follow them. And what happens then is that you basically then, once that date comes and the nominations are closed, now you could send out the formal meeting notice of the meeting. And within that meeting notice, there would be, it would indicate who's running for the board. And the benefit of that is that you could send out what's called, I call a proxy ballot, where the proxy has a ballot contained right within the proxy itself, where an individual shareholder can vote for the candidate that they want. And that ties right into your next bullet point there, which is a candidates night. So I've seen this both ways, right? So some buildings prefer that their shareholders get to meet the candidates, ask questions. So you could hold the candidates night virtually, just like you hold the annual meeting. And I think it's not a terrible idea to do that. Obviously, again, it would be controlled. Many buildings already hold candidate nights when they have nominations in advance. The difference, again, is that you're not going to have people shouting over each other, and you'll be able to control those questions.
It's a good way to do a test run, to hold a candidates night. And I've seen a lot of buildings that do candidates night ask for questions in advance to the candidates. So the bios will be circulated ahead of time. Questions can come out, and then the candidates have, a forum to address the shareholder community or owner community in terms of why they should be elected or why they want to be elected to the board.
Great. And then as far as third-party election companies, what are your feelings on that?
We've used a number of, there are probably three of the larger third-party companies to do voting, electronic voting, and things like that. And we've seen that being used, these companies being used across our portfolio. I personally think it's a good idea to do that, especially if there might be a contested election, or if there might be, for lack of better term, drama in the building, in dissent and things like that, or, any questions raised and things like that. So I think it would be helpful there. And then if the shareholder community, or if you're, with in a situation where it's not so sophisticated running of the building and things like that, where there's not a professional management company involved, then certainly having a third party, election company involved would be helpful in those situations.
Guys keep bringing up drama. Is there really drama? No, I'm kidding. And what about you, Marc? What are your thoughts on this?
I think there's a place for them. I will say most buildings don't use them. But I think I agree with Ajo in the sense that, if you think there's going to be, a contested election, and third-party election companies could be anybody, right? I agree with them. There's a few big ones, but you could also have a third party just simply do it, like an accountant or otherwise. I think if you set up your virtual annual meeting well and you have your proxy ballot system in place, everything's pretty much coming in before the night of the annual meeting. And, you pretty much know what your outcome of your election is before the meeting even starts. So, but either way, there is a place for them, and there are certainly some good ones out there. But I think you could do it either way.
Got it. All right. So how about communication? So clearly, throughout COVID, we've learned a lot about how to communicate virtually. So as far as just setting up this whole experience, the registering, giving notice of requirements and delivery methods, and then following the property bylaws, how do you handle this, since it's all now virtual, and in some cases before it really wasn't? And also, just because not all your constituents are receptive to, electronic delivery methods, for example. They might not be on email as readily. So how do you handle those types of situations?
Right. So, let's start with the first one, setup and registration. So typically your property manager, your attorney is going to wind up, setting this up for you. They're going to have the Zoom platform or whatever platform you choose. And what we've done when the notifications go out is we usually have a detailed sheet of instructions for the residents as to how they can participate in a Zoom, all the way down to what type of devices and what to click. And then we usually put a registration link in there. And the reason for the registration link, as opposed to just putting a Zoom link where you could directly get into the meeting, is it requires someone to register, put their information, and you will have their information when they come on the screen, and you will also be able to determine whether or not someone should or shouldn't be on the Zoom and to control that. The key to electronic is you want to make sure that the person who's really participating is the person that they are. Now, obviously, one of the negatives of a a Zoom meeting is that you don't know who's on the other side of the screen, so to speak. It's very hard to police that, but that just means that when you're presenting and you're giving information, just make sure that it's very accurate and tailor what you're going to tell somebody to the potential audience that could be there. For example, if you're going to talk about a potential litigation item with your shareholders, you'd have to be very careful about what you say. You'd have to assume that anything you say can be seen or obtained by your adversary. So that's how you do setup and registration. As far as notice requirements, you gotta follow what your governing documents say. Even though people have emails, you typically can't notice your meetings by email. You still have to use the original bylaw, the original methods in your bylaws. Now, again, like I said before, you can amend your governing documents to change these things. And I have boards that are actually doing that as we speak, because the times have changed. And now they want to keep using Zoom, but they don't want to keep using just Zoom. They want to be able to email people, and they want to be able to email them knowing that that notice is sufficient. I mean, look, to be honest with you, it's much more efficient to email someone than it is for it to get to the mail. We know that during the pandemic, the mail was delayed for a significantly long period of time, whether it was your bills or your notice of a meeting that was coming. So it's super important. Now, can a board do both? Can they mail and then also decide to email the set just, so that people get it faster? Yeah, you definitely can. There's no question, but you can't just do the email if it's not authorized for you. So I highly recommend that anybody that wants to continue to do this, consider amending your governing documents. Now, understand that amending governing documents in co-ops, I will say more so than in condos, many co-ops bylaws provide that they could be amended by the board, by just a vote of the board. So you might want to consider that and speak to your counsel to see if you could just make such an amendment on your own without having to go to the shareholders for a vote. Unfortunately, in condominiums, that's usually not the case. You probably need a unit owner vote, and which would mean you need a special meeting, but you could do that special meeting. Although again, since it's not authorized, there are definitely ways to accomplish that. It's just not as simple as the co-op setting.
And then Adjo, from a AKAM perspective, what have you been doing as far as communication is concerned to get the boards prepared?
So in terms of communication to the owners, I think it's as Marc said, you follow the bylaws, consult with the attorney, and that's huge now, right? To consult with the attorney, and really, even if it's a management company putting together the documents or the notice, the attorney should at the very least review it to make sure it's in accordance with the governing documents. And I think it's also important to add in there for anyone who needs tech help or any kind of questions regarding how the annual meeting might be run virtually, to contact the managing agent for any questions and things like that. And then we'd be happy, I know that our manager would be happy to help in that regard as well.
Great. And I think that was a really good note, Marc, about just, the way that you need to think about your meeting a little differently, just in the fact it could be recorded, or, it's good advice. All right. So the next situation will be proxy and ballots. So as far as clear instructions are concerned, can you touch upon how what you do in those cases?
Right. So, when the proxy ballot goes out, you typically will send a notice of the meeting and a proxy ballot, but I highly recommend, I'm sure Adjo agrees, a cover letter that explains the annual meeting. It explains voting. It explains how to vote. It explains who's eligible to vote. It explains who's running. It explains how to get on Zoom, all those different things, which is why I agree with Adjo. It's great advice that you gave, by the way, to definitely involve the attorney, because these are legal things. And what you want to avoid is the person who loses the election from successfully challenging the process, especially given that you're utilizing a slightly different method than you would in the past. So you want to be very clear about who to send the proxy to, how you can send it, whether it can be mailed, emailed, and most instances you can email the proxy. That's not notice. So we always provide the mailing address, the email address, and you could of course bring it, to deliver it to somebody as well. Obviously, when it's not in person, it's hard to deliver it, but you could probably slip it under somebody's door. We usually like to recommend a proxy ballot, as I indicated before, where the person can actually vote right on it. So now it's no longer just giving Ajo my proxy and saying, hey, Ajo, vote for whoever you want. I'm saying, Ajo, here's my proxy, or board, here's my proxy, but you are hereby directed to vote as follows. And I check off who I want that vote counted for. This way it gets sent in advance to the management company, and the management company just pop it into a spreadsheet, and away we go. Before you know it, we have our results before the meeting, typically even occurs. And if somebody's at the meeting, which happens often, and they haven't voted yet, we could say to them, take a picture and email the proxy ballot right over. Really, really simple.
Right. And I think that I've seen a lot across our portfolio, a lot of buildings still have the physical box for submitting your proxies at the lobby desk. And I think that's a great thing to do, to continue to do, even if you're running it in this format.
Great.
Right.
And as far as deadlines, how do you handle the deadlines in this situation?
Well, I mean, the deadlines are hard deadlines, right? I mean, you have a time period, like we said, the deadlines for the candidacy is one deadline. As far as the proxies, it spells out in the actual letter when you have to have it in. I mean, you can't send your proxy in after the voting is completed. I can't tell you how many times somebody gets on and they say, I just joined the meeting, I didn't vote. Well, we finished with that agenda item. The voting is completed, and the successful candidates have been declared the winners.
Right. And I think going back to the cover letter, that really just needs to be clearly spelled out that, because deadlines, they were important before, but even more important now because there are no real floor nominations. Right. So if your candidacy or your voting, as Marc said, we really need to just make sure that we communicate and there's that transparency that the deadlines are hard, and there won't be any candidates or voting taken after it's completed on the agenda.
It sounds though that it's almost more organized in some ways than before, because it's a little bit more rigid, like in a good way, I would think.
Yes.
I think these sounds like improvements on process, which might be beneficial in the end. And then as far as submission locations, how to handle that?
Well,
so I might have jumped on sorry, Marc, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I might have jumped ahead on that, but yeah, there are submissions across the portfolio that I've seen, and I'm sure Marc have seen, that there are physical box locations for people to drop off the proxy ballot and things like that.
Yeah, but alternatively, most of it's going to come submitted by email.
Got it.
Correct.
So those are both alternatives. And that's the example where I was saying if someone is not comfortable with the email form, there might be a hard copy that they can hand in.
Yeah, and by the way, that ties in, to the deadline, which is if you're going to mail your ballot. Like, for example, I'll say, if you are mailing your ballot, it must be received by a certain date, not mailed, right? You can't just say, I put it in the mailbox, today's the day of the annual meeting. No, your proxy must be received. And usually we'll tell them, received by if it's coming to the management company by usually hours before the meeting, because if it comes in the mail after that and you're already on like when you were attending a meeting, right, the manager's on his way to the meeting, he can't get the proxy at 6 o'clock and have that document be counted because he's already on his way. So yeah, it's important to spell it out, which, Ajo and I are in complete agreement. It's that cover letter that's got to be crystal clear so that there's no question about what the policies and the procedures are.
Great. All right. So the next topic.
And by the way, there's a question in the Q&A box that I think is right on line with that topic.
Oh yeah?
Yeah, which says, someone asked, how much time do you recommend we send out the proxy and ballots by? And that's going to be dictated by your bylaws, right? So most of your bylaws are going to say that your annual meeting must be noticed not more than a certain number of days and not less than a certain number of days. Most co-ops are 5 or 10 days at a minimum and 30 or 40 at a maximum. I will tell you, in condos, I've seen 5 and 10 day periods. I did a set of amendments for a community where we proposed increasing the time limitations along with a bunch of other amendments, and people voted no for every amendment, including the amendment that said we want to change it so that we can give up to 30 or 60 days notice. No, you'd rather have only 10 days notice. So you're governed by what that bylaw provision says as far as how much. You can't send a proxy ballot out before the formal notice of the meeting goes out.
Mhm.
Right.
Got it. All right. So as far as the meeting is concerned, what are the technical and MC duties that are associated with that?
So technically, it's on the technical side of it, there should always be somebody that's focused. I mean, there's a whole host of things, right? The day of the meeting, there should be, a regroup people should be checking their internet connections, especially if you're on the board or if you're presenting, auditor, attorney, checking your internet connections and things of that sort. And then during the meeting, there should be somebody that's pretty much focused on the technical aspects of it to make sure that, if there are any issues and things like that, that there is somebody there to take care of those types of things. MC duties, it really, I mean, Marc, I'll push it to you too. I think that in large part, it stays pretty much the same if it's the manager running, the attorney running, or the board president or another board member running the meeting. I think that pretty much stays the same in that regard.
Yeah, I would agree with you. And just to jump back on the technical one, I mean, I could share, a story with you. A lot of people don't realize if you're a very large building, if you're going to do Zoom, you better make sure that the person who's hosting that Zoom meeting has the ability to handle all of the residents if they all attend. There are limits on accounts. If you have a free account, that's different than an account you pay for. And on the accounts you pay for, the pricing changes based upon the number of attendees that you're allowed to have. So it's very important that you make sure that whoever's hosting it has the ability. I've also seen others. I had an annual meeting where someone else hosted it, and like Hadra said, their internet connection was awful, and it was a disaster as a result of the internet connection, and we had to ultimately redo it. Look, sometimes you can't prevent that, but you have to make sure that if you're going to use another vendor, that they have the bandwidth to handle the volume that you might otherwise have.
Right. Otherwise, It sounds like an alien abducted your meeting. Now it's being hosted on Mars, where some people might have that as their background. You don't want that to be your meeting. So, yes, that's very solid advice.
Yeah, and I think having a backup host is important just in case any number of reasons, internet connection, etc.
Yep. Yeah, I always panic with internet connection. So I think that's definitely solid advice. And then as far as the agenda, how do you set that? It sounds like a lot of the actual meeting is not that much different than a regular meeting.
As far as the agenda and even the quorum, that stuff is all the same, right? The agenda is what your normal agenda is. I know a lot of people follow the agenda in the bylaws. Most bylaws set forth a sample agenda, or one that it's supposed to cover. I call it like the minimum things you're going to cover. But you set your agenda and you follow it, and your quorum is whatever your bylaws say. The difference is, and it's really not a difference actually, your quorum can always be met by proxy and in person. So here, proxies are going to count. It's important to get people to vote and to submit their proxy so that you can have a quorum. So that's not going to change.
But the voting procedure and the tallying, will that change because now it's electronic?
That might change a little bit because, I mean, typically, you have inspectors of election, which you can have and you should have, if shareholders want them, or it calls for it in your bylaws or the governing documents of the co-op or the condo. But obviously, you're not going to be having two people go into a back room where people are going to know they're in the back room, or they're going to be tabulating it in front of them because it's digital. And that's why I think when you lay it out in the cover letter, you're going to explain out the process. Typically, it's just going to be because it's electronic. And if someone challenges it, the beauty of a proxy ballot that's electronic is you have the records. It's not hard. Not like papers are getting lost all over the place.
That's true. Unless it gets taken to space, and then you're in trouble. No, I'm kidding.
Yes.
And then how about the post meeting? How do you handle anything different there?
So I think that's pretty much handled the same in terms of announcement of election, posting at the building, physical posting at the building, email, or through a building like type of service if the building has that. Mm-hmm. And then there are a number of things in terms of checklist items to do post annual meeting. in terms of follow-ups, especially if it ran long for whatever reason and you couldn't get to all of the questions in the Q&A. You could send a memo out answering those questions, such as just letting everybody know that you weren't able to get to a number of questions and here are the answers or the responses for those.
Yeah, I agree with you. I've seen that happen. And similarly, that's one of the reasons why I kind of like the idea of asking for questions in advance. Look, it'll enable us to get you the answers while you're all there. If someone throws a question out, it's really no different than if they were live. If they throw a question out and you don't have the answer, you're going to say, I got to get back to you on it.
Right.
Right. And just in terms of the preparation, there should also really be somebody that's manning the Q&A box, right? In smaller buildings, maybe you might not need that, but in larger buildings, depending on the volume of questions that are coming in, it'll be hard for somebody who's also emceeing or doing some other function with it or for the annual to manage the Q&A portion of it and move it to, and just track it to move it to answered and things like that.
And by the way, there are features on Zoom, like raise your hand feature, where you can see on the side, so the person running it will see it. There are some other great features that you should be aware of if you're conducting it by Zoom, which is you can mute everybody when they enter the room, enter the Zoom, and you could also turn off their ability to unmute themselves so that you don't have people interrupting in the middle. So there's a couple of neat features like that. And the other one that I typically recommend for anybody that's doing this is to turn off the ability for people to chat with each other. I usually limit it to chatting with the host only, so that you don't have this whole sidebar that's going on that then creates a lot of other unnecessary, questions. Look, you can't stop people from texting each other if they're friends, but you can, again, try and keep it as organized as possible. And again, I think Adjo and I both agree that these Zoom meetings, they are much more efficient than an in-person meeting.
Right.
Yeah, certainly.
You just lose the people aspect of it, or the personal touch aspect. And hopefully, as there can be other events, community type events in and around the building when things ease up a little bit more and people are more comfortable doing that, so that you still keep with that. I know that for a lot of building and shareholders or unit owners, the annual meeting was a place to kind of like interact, socialize as well before and after. So I think the boards should keep that in mind and maybe do something over the summer, whether it's in a courtyard or someplace like that when things open up again. I think that'll be helpful.
I think that's a really good idea.
And it's key that, even as gathering limits, get less and less, you want to be as safe as possible. And if you're going to do something that's formal, like an annual meeting, you have to make sure that you can accommodate everyone if they all want to come. You can't assume that only 20% are going to come. Otherwise, you're setting yourself up for a failure or somebody to say, hey, you're violating whatever protocol you should be violating. The last thing you want is for somebody to say, I got sick or I got COVID at my building's annual meeting.
Yeah, that would not be good. Yeah, no, that's very true. All right, so speaking of Q&A, we're here at the Q&A. So over time, people have put in some questions and we welcome you to put in questions now. And again, if we don't get back to you in this portion, we're always, all of our information will be at the end and we will get back to you as soon as we can. But in the meantime, let's get started with the Q&A. So someone is asking, can they cancel their annual meeting if they don't want to do it virtually and hold it later when they can meet in person?
So the answer to that is, right, we know that your bylaws say you must hold an annual meeting, and then typically most of them say, approximately when it should be. We're in the middle of a pandemic, and you don't think you can do it safely, and you think that your building is not one of those buildings that's got people that are going to really be able to get on Zoom and do it well. And I know everybody's like, who doesn't know how to use Zoom? I can tell you right now, I spoke to somebody today who, when we said, do you know how to use Zoom? They said, no, I don't know how to use Zoom. So in that event, waiting for a date when you could actually hold it, physically is typically fine. I don't know too many judges that are going to chastise a board for not holding their annual meeting in the middle of a pandemic. And if a shareholder wants to compel a board to hold an annual meeting, there's a protocol for it and there's a statute that governs it. So there's a way for shareholders to compel you to do so. So the answer is I think if you're one of those boards that says, I just don't think we can do a Zoom, and I don't think it's safe yet to do it in person, I think you can. But again, I'm not looking at your governing documents, and I qualify my answer. But typically, I do have many buildings that have still not held an annual meeting since the pandemic started.
Okay. And Ajo, what are your feelings as far as, have most buildings conducted annual meetings virtually at this point?
I would say I think it's a good mix, and probably leaning toward most have conducted annual meetings. There are several that and some are holding off for the summer and doing it in a large courtyard that they may have if the building has that luxury to do that. But again, as Marc said, you have to facilitate for everybody to be able to come, and then also just make sure that you're vetting that risk of somebody getting sick and and that being an issue because they attended the annual meeting.
Right. So in that case, it sounds like the risk is not worth. It's worth the wait. It's worth the wait.
Right.
How far in advance should they hold the Meet the Candidates session?
Well, the answer to that is I recommend that if you're going to hold a Meet the Candidates, that you do it before your formal notice goes out, because if you're going to ask people to vote and that you're really looking for everybody to know their candidates, you want them to know who they are before the proxy ballot and the notice hit them in the mail. Once the proxy ballot and notice hit them in the mail, people may have already voted.
Okay.
Right.
And then how can a voting quorum be guaranteed?
I don't think there's any way to guarantee it, but if you really want to accomplish it, then you're going to have to assign somebody or people to go calling people to compel them to send their proxies in. And I have boards that do that. The board will split it up and they'll say, I'm going to call these 10, you call these 10, and they try to accomplish it. It's like I said, doing it virtually, it's a lot easier than it is when you used to have to knock on the door.
Right.
All right. This is a longer one. I hope I can read through it. If I get it right, great. If I don't, I apologize. All right. If our co-op did not hold board elections during 2020 and 3 board members up for election simply carries on in their position, but now they want to hold an in-person election during 2021, how do they elect 2 years of directors, meaning 6 people instead of 3, now during the summer of 2021? Are there any options?
Well, so here's my interpretation of this issue, and I've had it with many of my boards. And I can tell you that not everybody will agree, but I think that this is the best approach. If you're a board that has staggered terms, the concept is that you're not supposed to elect the entire board in one given year. And it's supposed to be so that a board doesn't get wiped out in 1 year. If you look at most bylaws will say that the person is elected for, let's say it's 3-year term, for 3 years or until their successor is elected, which means it could be 4 years, it could be 5 years. So what I would recommend to my boards is that whoever would have been up at the annual meeting that you didn't hold would be up, and everybody would be extended so that everything just gets pushed out. So if it's a year and a half, it's just pushed out a year and a half. So if you haven't held an annual meeting and the last one you held was a year and a half, was 2.5 years ago now, because you were going to hold one when the pandemic started a year and a half ago. And when you were going to hold it hypothetically in May of 2020, there was a pandemic and you didn't do it. Whichever 3 board members that were up in May of 2020 will be up when you do your annual meeting, whether it's now in September of this year or December or November or whatever you're doing.
Interesting. All right. Can the board of directors itself nominate the slate and second, or do you need someone else to do it?
It could be a board member. It's not the board itself, but it's a motion is made by any shareholder or unit owner who's at the meeting, and then you ask for a second, and there you go. Now, if you're talking about nominating the slate, I'm not sure if this question is we're understanding it completely. Are you saying can the board say the board wants to nominate all these people and then other people nominate others? I mean, the answer is when there's a letter that's sent out that says if you want to run, you should submit your candidacy by a certain date. Every board member who wants to run, including board members, should send their email in that says, I want to run.
Right.
There's no issue. You don't want there to be an issue where someone says, how did that person, they didn't even say anything, their friend on the board nominated them. And by the way, some of this I want to qualify it. I've seen it in some, but not in many. Some bylaws have very specific nomination procedures. And if you do, then you have to consult with your attorney to see how you can get this done within the confines of that, or you may have to amend your governing documents.
How are you authorizing condominiums to have annual virtual meetings if they're not covered by the executive order?
So it's a creative way of doing it. And what I would say is, for the person that asked that question, you're probably better off emailing me or calling me offline. It's because it requires probably a lengthier discussion. But there's definitely an approach to it.
That's good to know. All right, and everyone, just so we all remember, all of our information will be provided at the end of today. So please feel free to reach out to us. All right, what can you do if someone insists, speaking of, on recording the meeting?
I think when you're doing a virtual annual meeting, like I said, you have to assume someone's recording it. You're not going to know because let's say that they're not hitting the button on the screen, but they take their phone and their phone, I mean, right now I could be recording this. You don't see my phone.
We are recording this.
And you would, and it doesn't have to be a video, it could be an audio, right? Now, when we were in person, I would always say this is not recorded. And I once had someone come put their phone on a tripod. And I said, look, we're not consenting to this. If you don't stop, the meeting will end. So you have that certainly that approach. But I think in today's day and age, it's almost impossible. Somebody's going to record it. Assume you're being recorded. Don't discuss anything that you would not be comfortable with someone else having a recording of.
Yeah. All right. Can the board president cancel the Zoom meeting at the start of the Zoom meeting because he or she just saw the proxy submitted right before the meeting commenced, and then strategically delay the meeting a month or two to try and change shareholders' votes? Ooh, this is the drama you men were talking about.
You probably answered that question before you asked it. The answer is, can a board president adjourn a meeting? Anybody could do what they want. Is it legal and valid to stop a meeting just because they want to try get a different result? No, I think they would have a pretty serious election challenge if somebody knew that was what had occurred.
Got it. All right. And that was probably more hypothetical anyway. All right. If we typically hold meetings in November and miss 2020, can we have a meeting in September 2021 and then have the next one in either summer 2022 or November 2022?
So if you have a meeting typically in November and you miss 2020, and now you want to have one in the summer of 2021, look at your governing documents. Typically they're annual, right? And what I would suggest to a board, if your bylaws say they must be in November, well, then you should try and get it back there. Maybe over a course of a year or two, you work your way back to it. But again, the election is typically a year term if it's a year, and your bylaws don't call for it and they don't have a particular date. Why not continue it with the summer and each year and go that way?
Okay. If they typically hold meetings in November and miss 2020, we already just answered that. Sorry. I think I just read the same thing twice. What can residents do if board members have not followed election rotation rules in the past 5 years and they keep changing bylaws to keep their seats to prevent? This sounds another hypothetical. So, let's just say that because people are, willing, these are hypothetical questions now, but are there election rotation rules? Maybe that's just more a general question, are there, and that's probably more bylaw related as well.
You're right on target. The answer is your bylaws dictate the terms of the board members. If a board doesn't comply with their bylaws, obviously there's a recourse for that. But I will say to you that, again, certain bylaws allow boards to amend the bylaws. Also, there are certain boards that might be able to fill a vacancies if there's a vacancy and they're filling a term. So there are various ways of doing things legally, and it may not look like it's something that's allowed, but it may ultimately be something that's permissible. But I agree with Elise. It's a fact pattern. It's a hypothetical. I would need to see the exact circumstances and the exact documents to be able to answer your question accurately.
Yeah, it just sounds like, as most cases, it all goes back to your bylaws, and it's no different for an annual meeting than any other, virtually or not virtually.
Correct.
Yeah. And then, I guess we'll just finish with this one. And of course, we encourage everyone to please feel free to ask further questions. But how do you handle shareholders that are not tax savvy or don't have a computer? Because, you know, there are those people out there for sure, and we want to make sure that they're able to get their vote in and have their voice be heard.
Well, I think from a voting perspective, that's why the proxy ballot is really great, because all they have to do is they could stick it in the mail, or they could take a picture of it and send it to you, or they could ask someone to give it to you. From an attendance perspective, tell them to ask a neighbor to come turn their device on, or to register them for the meeting. I think, you know, everybody should have somebody that could help them. I will tell you, I have done a number of these, many of them already, and I haven't heard too many people say, I couldn't hear it, I couldn't see it, I couldn't get on it. You know, sure, does it happen more often than not? It might be their internet connection's bad. And look, I will tell you, you know, I've had some buildings that said, well, we don't want to do it because most of our residents are not tech savvy. It might be the case, and then maybe you're not going to do a virtual annual meeting. But I do submit to you that you might want to try a virtual informational meeting first before you do a formal annual meeting, and see how it goes and see what the feedback is, and tell everybody, we're not going to schedule the annual meeting yet. We're going to do an informational meeting just to see how this works and to make sure that everybody's comfortable with it.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like, you know, what I think is great about what's happened during COVID is that buildings are really utilizing their community and helping, you know, everyone within a building. So whether it is help with a proxy or otherwise, you know, there are ways to, you know, help your neighbor. And I've seen, I personally have heard and seen great stories about that. And I think in this case, it's really no different. And yes, of course, you're losing the, you know, the human element of seeing people in person, but there's a lot to be gained by the virtual, because again, there's an increase in attendance potentially. There might be that you knock on your neighbor's door to get their ballot, you know, maybe you wouldn't have spoken to them in other circumstances. So there is positives, I think, that have come from a virtual annual meeting, and it encourages people to think outside of the annual meeting to have community with their building. So I think those are a nice, you know, features I've seen, at least with these types of meetings and just in general. Yeah. Any other thoughts? I was trying to end on a positive note. It's my inspirational speech for annual
look, I think
people excited.
Like I said at the beginning, you know, out of a pandemic has come some good things, and I think that, you know, obviously we would all like to have not had to experience the pandemic, and, you know, God willing, this will be behind us at some point. But, you know, virtual annual meetings is a great thing. Not only virtual annual meetings, I mean, look, there's virtual board meetings. Think about what technology has done for many of us to be able to continue to operate. So I say embrace some change. You might be surprised at how pleased you are with the experience.
Right. And I think I would just add that, again, it's important to include your legal counsel in these discussions and decisions on how you're going to run the annual meeting. There were several questions here about board terms and things like that, and that's where really you want to get that advice. And then it's about the communication and the preparation for it, and making sure that, like we said earlier, with regards to the cover letter, and clearly putting instructions on the cover letter, and then the preparation by doing advanced mock trial runs, and doing your test preparations with internet connections and such like that.
Great. All right. Unfortunately, our internet wasn't so bad this run. So thank you, internet gods. All right. Well, thank you everyone for your time. Thank you so much, Adjo. Thank you so much, Marc. We really appreciate your advice tonight. Our information is on the screen right now. We encourage you, whether it be now or whenever, please always write to us. We love to hear from you. We love to get your questions answered. And we look forward to hearing about your virtual annual meetings. So anyway, have a great evening. Be safe, and we'll see you soon. Thanks so much. Have a good night. Bye.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone.
Thank you.